So today I want to cover a very common, frequently asked question that I get, and one that's especially been coming up recently. I don't know why, but a lot of people have been asking me about dilutions, and there's really two questions surrounding them. I'm going to answer both of them in this video. The first question is, why bother making pre-dilutions? Why do I need to go and do all of that? And then the second one is, well, if I go and follow all of your content and make these pre-dilutions, I start ending up with these perfumes that end up around 10%-ish concentration. But that's not strong enough for me because I want to go and make a 20% eau de parfum. So how do I then go and scale it up if I'm using all these pre-dilutions? So in this video, I'm going to explain exactly both of those things. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit about why to use pre-dilutions and how to scale them up, then definitely stick around for this video. So firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about why bother using pre-dilutions in the first place. I'm going to give you what I think are probably the two main reasons for that, though there are a few others as well. And then at the end of the video, I'm actually going to walk you through step by step how to go and scale up the formulas that you've made using all these pre-dilutions and how to make them into the desired concentrations and amounts that you want. I'm going to do this firstly if you use my Formulair app, which is nice and easy. And then secondly, if you don't have that app, I'm also going to show you how you can, on Microsoft Excel, I'm literally going to walk you through step by step a spreadsheet, how you can go and make it and do all the calculations. So even if you can't use Formulair, you can just go and do the calculations yourself in Excel anyway. So that's what I'm going to give you in this video. So to begin with then, why bother using pre-dilutions? There's really two main areas or two main reasons for this. One of them has to do with actually learning your raw materials, and a second has to do with formulating your perfumes. So if you remember back to my main kind of perfume making tutorial video, you'll have noticed in my kind of model for making perfumes, I say the number one most important first step to take is actually knowing your raw materials, because without that, how are you going to compose your perfumes? So that's step one. So it's important for doing these dilutions. And then again, it's also important later on when you get to step 3, making those perfumes. So what are those two reasons? Well, the first one is in evaluation and learning your raw materials. When you have a pure raw material, it doesn't necessarily give you an accurate depiction of what that will look like in a perfume. So I've got one of my favorite examples here for this kind of thing, which is manzanite. And I've got it as a pure raw material and also a 1% dilution. I've also got some scent strips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 1% pre-dilution of manzanite and I'm going to dip the scent strip in. Now 1% is kind of like the second step down. And for manzanite, which is a really strong aroma chemical, I would say this is probably about, equivalent to maybe like a 10% dilution of some other raw materials. So this also at 1%. In a real perfume, you'd still use manzanite, ending up at a much lower level, usually than 1%. 1% would be really high to have it in your perfume. So this, when I open it, when I put it on the scent strip, I can smell it, even about 5 centimeters away from my nose. It's kind of a nice diffusive fruity smell. I got to it and it's kind of a nice appley, sweet, fruity kind of apple smell. So yeah, it also has a little bit of a strawberry facet to it as well. So this kind of gives me a good idea of this raw material and what it might smell like, and therefore how I might go and use it in a perfume. I'm now going to do the same experiment and take the pure manzanite and I'm going to dip a scent strip inside of that. So with the pure manzanite, when I go to smell that, to my nose, this is kind of like a really harsh, strong, solventy, chemical kind of smell. It smells a little bit acrid almost. It's very strong and pungent. And doesn't really smell fruity at all. It just kind of smells like solvents and things like that. It's very odd. And the thing is, here's the point I'm trying to make. If I'd have got my raw materials and I just opened the bottle and started smelling this pure manzanite, you smell it and you would think, what the hell is this stuff? It smells so weird. Why on earth would I ever want to go and use that in a perfume? And that's because it's just way too strong at this level. This stuff, it's like, your nose is like being completely overloaded by these molecules and bombarded, and it's just way too strong. And the thing is, if you don't go and do your pre-dilutions, you don't dilute it down to 10% and 1%, you'll never realize that actually the stuff starts to smell quite nice down at 1% and 10%. And more importantly, that 1% and 10% for most raw materials is actually a lot more representative of the kinds of levels you may be starting to use those in your actual final perfumes, as opposed to 100%, you're never going to be using anything near to 100% in your perfume, because already your perfume is usually only like 10 or 20% raw material anyway, plus, like 80-90% alcohol. So already, a 10% dilution kind of represents, in a lot of cases, getting on close to most of your perfume concentrate, which, when you're composing a perfume, you very rarely anyway have one raw material as almost the whole of your concentrate. So it's just kind of unrealistic to be smelling things at, any dilution higher than that, aka pure. So that's why I think from a learning raw materials point of view, that it's not really worth smelling things so much pure, but you want to learn in the dilution. And this is also kind of backed up by, if you go and look at perfumery schools and how they teach, or texts on perfumery, you will notice, you see it's recommended often that you evaluate raw materials and go and learn them in pre-dilution. So if you've looked at some writings by Edmund Rudnitzer, who's a very well-renowned and famous perfumer of the last century, he recommends in his text for teaching students, go and learn your raw materials at 10% and 1%, a bit depending on the strength of them. So by diluting your raw materials to 10% and 1%, you get ideas for how strong relatively each ones are. For example, the manzanate, it's only when you do that 1% dilution and you realize, oh wow, it's still very strong, that you realize, wow, this is a really strong raw material. Or something like hedione, you may go and dilute that down to 1% and you may realize, oh wow, it's starting to get a little bit weak at this point. So actually something like 10%, having a larger amount is a bit more appropriate. And this is also very useful, because when you're going to compose your perfumes, it starts to give you your first inklings of ideas of how strong you may want to leave these raw materials in your formulations that you come up with. So that is on the evaluation side of things and learning raw materials. However, there's also another side to it, and that is your formulas. And the reason for that is, if you're a hobbyist and someone who makes perfumes at home, buying all of these different raw materials is actually very expensive. So usually because of that, most people being on a budget, myself included, you don't want to use more raw materials than you have to. So what people often do is they try to get away with making their formulas as small as possible, which, completely makes sense. I do that too. However, you get to a certain point where you can't actually weigh out something accurately any longer on the scale when you make it smaller. And that's because a normal drop size is between about 0.01 and 0.05 grams, obviously it depends on the raw material. So if you're writing formulas of any amounts kind of in that region or smaller, you're starting to get to the point where it may be inaccurate to weigh it out. Now, the solution for this, or a great solution I think, is to use pre-dilutions. Because if you compose all of your formula with 10% pre-dilutions, i.e. it's kind of only 10% raw material and 90% alcohol, it means when you get down to that lowest end of what your scale can weigh, you can still weigh down to that same level accurately, but each drop of thing you add is now going to have, say, something like 10 times less actual raw material inside of it. So you're using 10 times less of your raw materials from your cupboard, the raw materials that you bought from your supplier, by having already diluted them down to 10%. And then when you go and make that formula, it just naturally ends up around 10% anyway, which is nice, because that's similar to a real perfume concentration. Normally perfume concentrations are somewhere about like 7 to 20%-ish. So it kind of lies in that range, which makes it quite nice if you're sketching things out, testing out ideas. So in summary, when you're trying to save raw materials, i.e. use as little possible, your limiting factor is the smallest amount of the smallest thing in your formula that you can weigh. And by diluting everything, you can still weigh out that same small weight, but because everything is 10 times less concentrated, you've used 10 times less raw material that you've paid your money for. So that means, in theory, you've got enough raw material in your cupboard to last you 10 times more trials. So, you're just buying less stuff, you're saving a bit of money. So that's why to go and use these pre-dilutions. The next thing then is, okay, cool, I've gone and, like you said, made all of these trials, saved my money, not burn out my nose, done it, but then now I want to go and actually make my 20% eau de parfum, and I just don't see how it's going to happen, because I feel like I'm limited to around 10% of the pre-dilutions. So now we're going to hop into Formulair, and I'm going to show you how you can use Formulair to go and do that scaling. So you rescale your formula in terms of pure raw materials to make that 20% eau de parfum. And then after that, we're going to hop into Excel. I'm going to show you the exact same thing, but we're going to manually write out a spreadsheet so you can actually do those calculations yourself. And you're going to take the roughly 10% formula you've made with the pre-dilutions. I'm going to teach you how to scale it up to 20%. And essentially the way you do this is by using a mixture of pure raw materials and sometimes dilutions if you want to as well, and then just top it up with alcohol at the end. So we're just going to make the same formula by a different method, but we're going to switch around the numbers a bit to keep the proportions the same, but essentially allow us to add less of that alcohol that was originally used in all those pre-dilutions overall to get a more strong, more concentrated formula out, but it's still the same, relatively speaking, proportionally speaking, it's the same formula. It's just now everything's been made stronger. Right, so I've opened up Formulair and I've written a formula for you guys. So this formula is kind of like a simplistic formula that's meant to be representative of what one of your perfumes might look like if you'd gone and used these different pre-dilutions to compose it. So you've got usually a lot of formula entries which are made at your 10% or whatever your base dilution is, and then maybe sometimes you've got some strong things that you may want to add just a little touch of, so maybe you go and use a 1% or lower dilution. So this is what your formula might look like, and then you may make it up to 100 grams or whatever you want. It doesn't really matter, and you can see your different proportions. So right here on the right-hand side, we've got the, I would say, absolute concentrations here. So this is how I like to formulate, and it shows that our total concentration of the formula also is 9.66%. Now, a lot of people like to formulate as a percentage of concentrate. So if we click around, we can see the actual proportions of this formula as they are of a concentrate. So what we want to do is we want to take our pre-diluted formula that we've got, where we've got these percents, and we want to scale that 9.66 up to get a total 20% eau de parfum. And then at the end, we may also want to scale the total weight as well. So if we've done that, we essentially want to take essentially these proportions, right, that we've got here. So all of them, relatively speaking, this 100% as a concentrate, and we just want to scale that concentrate up to be 20% of the total composition. So how are we going to do that? Well, the way I like to do this is using the exchange solvent functionality that's found within Formulair. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an alcohol entry. So this could be your perfume as alcohol. And what I want to do is all of the solvent that's tied up in these 10% dilutions, I want to take it out of those dilutions and dump it into a pure solvent entry. Because once we've got that alcohol inside the solvent entry, then we can go and use Formulair's scaling function to then scale that 9.66 up to the 20% that we want. So at the moment, if we try to scale the formula, it's currently 9.658%. And it's saying, hey, we can't scale it up any more than we already would, because we want to use this scale formula to absolute percentage functionality, right? So in order to be able to scale that formula further up to 20%, what we need to do to make that possible is to actually already exchange some of the solvent that we've got tied up in these dilutions into the alcohol entry for Formulair to then go and calculate how much to get rid of later. So I'm going to right click on an entry. So the Hedione 10%, we're going to do dilutions and scaling, choose the exchange solvent option, and now we're going to go from the 10% up to 100%. And what that's going to do is it's going to exchange the solvent. It's going to take the current 30 grams of Hedione and it's going to split it up into 3 grams of pure Hedione that was inside of that 10% pre-dilution, and the other 27 grams that was in the pre-dilution is going to now dump back out into the perfume as alcohol entry. So we've not changed the actual formula. We've just rewritten it in terms of Hedione 100% instead of 10%, and then that excess alcohol has now come out into the solvent. Now, when we go and try to scale our formula again, because we've now made some space available, we can now scale the formula up to 13.2%. So you can probably see now that by doing that process repeatedly, we're increasing the level up to which we can scale, because we're creating more and more space inside the formula, i.e. we're making more and more perfumes alcohol that we can cut out. So we're going to repeat that process with the ISOE Super, exchange solvent to 100%, ethylene brassylate, again, dilutions and scaling, exchange solvent, make it 100%. Same thing we can do for the homofuranial, exchange solvent and make it 100%. So then we can do the same for the Texas cedarwood even, exchange solvent 100%. We can do the same for the galbanum, exchange solvent, make it 100%. And, you know, if you want, we could do it for the rose as well. Why not? Let's go and do it for the rose. So exchange solvent, make it 100%. So again, we've done nothing to the formula, right? All of the actual amounts have stayed the same. But as you can see, we've now just moved some of these, we've made the dilutions 100% instead of the 10% that they were. And what that's done is it's made less weight of the raw material, but it's put the remaining weight into the perfume as alcohol. So now if we go to dilutions and scaling on the total formula, you see it says scale formula to absolute percentage. We can now scale up pretty high, and we can scale up to 71%, and we don't actually want it that strong. Remember we said we wanted a 20% eau de parfum. So I'm just going to type in 20 to make our formula 20% concentrated. Scale formula, and there we go. It's scaled it up now. So it's all of these entries have been scaled proportionately so that the total concentration now is 20%. If you go and look at these proportions, and if you skip back a bit to the start of the video, these are still the same as they were before. So the formula, in a relative sense, hasn't changed. It's just in an absolute sense, everything's gone a bit more strong because we've made it to 20%. So that is pretty much all you have to do. To make the same formula stronger, we're now using a mixture of pure things, so pure raw materials. You'd weigh out these ones with 100% pure, and then these two we're still using the 1%. So now you can fine-tune this a little bit to make what's convenient for you. So firstly, let's say, okay, I actually only want to make 40 grams. Let's say I want to make a 50 ml bottle of perfume. Usually, because perfume is a bit lighter than water, it's a bit less dense, you don't need quite as many grams of perfume to fill up a milliliter. So to make 50 ml of perfume, usually it would be roughly 40 grams. So obviously you'd have to weigh this for your own perfume because each one is a little bit different. But let's say for now we're going to scale the formula, and I want to, instead of making 100 grams of perfume, I just want to make 40 grams. So I'm going to do that, scale it to a new total weight of 40 grams. We'll scale it. Now I'm going to have a look at the numbers. So as it scaled it to 40 grams, so 39.909, that was the best job it could because of, you know, the rounding of these numbers. So it's close enough. If we want to fix that, we can just go and add, you know, a 0.1 somewhere. It doesn't really matter, right? So we've got 40 grams, 20%. So we could follow this formula literally and make it, and it would be correct. 100%. So we take our pure Hedione, we put in 2.485 grams, pure ICB Super, 2.458 grams. And then, you know, we weigh all of these out. And then at the end, we need to top it up with 28.884 grams of alcohol. Now, we don't necessarily have to do this either. For example, there's a lot of our 1% dilution of Amber Rome Absolute. If you wanted, we could use a 10% dilution instead, right? So we can still go and do that dilutions and scaling, exchange solvent back to 10%. And now we've rewritten the formula, so we're going to use our 10% pre-dilution now to make it. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways of writing this same formula. And depending on how we decide to write it, it will change, you know, how much of each thing we can add. So if, for example, we wanted to actually use our pre-dilution for rose essence instead of using the pure thing, maybe we're worried about the accuracy of weighing 1.82 grams, or maybe it's just we lost it or something, and, you know, we want to use our pre-dilution, we can, again, dilutions and scaling to the rose essence, which is 100%, use that exchange solvent function again, and now bring it back to the 10%. Again, this hasn't changed the formula, we've just rewritten it. So I'll change that back. And the reason for that is because, well, actually, this is going to be the final formula in these pre-dilutions that we calculate with the Excel example, which I'm about to show you guys. So you can go and compare as well at the end, and the numbers should be the same. So this is how you do it in Formulair. It's really that simple. You go and scale it using those features that I just told you, and then you simply now read the formula back and weigh it out as it says. So Hedione 100%, add this many grams, and then at the end we've got a couple of ones which are kept in dilution. So yeah, that's all there is to it. Now we're going to head over into Excel, and I'm going to show you, if you don't have Formulair, how you can actually go and do all of these calculations manually yourself on a spreadsheet. Right, so what if you don't have an Apple product and you can't download Formulair? Well, in that case, I'm going to show you guys how to do it manually. Now I'm working on a really cool project, which isn't quite ready yet, but this is gonna make life a lot easier for you Windows users especially. So unfortunately, nothing to share about that so far. More information hopefully later on this year. But for now, I'm going to show you how you can actually just go and do the calculations manually in Excel. And of course, you don't have to use Excel. You can just go and do it manually with a calculator or some other method as well. But I'm going to show you the equations so you at least have a method of doing it. I've come up with a kind of a little spreadsheet for you. So we're going to go through that now. Now, I will say that I generally find there are two types of people in perfumery. There's, on one hand, the people who have got like some kind of maths or science background, and to them, these calculations are really like basic and intuitive, and it just makes complete sense. So, you know, I could walk through the spreadsheet once and they'll just be like, oh yeah, that's completely obvious. On the other hand, I find there are people who maybe they just, you know, the last time they did maths was in like high school, like 10 years ago or something like that. And they don't use maths much in their life. And when they look at all these numbers, they find it completely overwhelming. So if you're one of those people, obviously, without doing it in an app that makes it easier for you, you are going to have to do some dealing with these numbers yourself. But hopefully the spreadsheet will make it a little bit easier. Worst case, if you don't understand it, you can just literally copy exactly what I'm doing and it should work out just fine. Now, of course, if you do want to go and develop that understanding, I would probably recommend that you just go and Google or YouTube the maths of percentages, because that's going to really help you out. Like in probably half an hour of videos, you can really get the basics of just the maths of percentages. You should find it not too hard. It's basically like, you know, what is something out of 100? And then, you know, doing that should probably allow you to understand all the stuff that's going on here. Anyway, let's get into it. So I've gone and got the exact same formula that I was working with in Formulair, and I've just gone and exported it and imported it into Excel. So we've got the weight, the dilution, the relative percent, the percent concentrate, and the absolute percent. Now for this example, we don't really need these two percentages. So even if you've got your formula just written as which pre-dilutions you've used and the weights of each one, that's pretty much all we need. So we're going to start making some more columns, and that's going to allow us to do the calculation. So the first column I want to make is the actual dilution. And the reason for that, oops, I'll put a 5 there. That was meant to be percent. So the reason for that is I actually need to work with this number here that we've got. So these dilutions have been kind of hard code written. So I'm going to just write them out. 10% for Hedione, 10% ISOE Super, 10% ethylene brassylate, 10, 10, 10, and then these two are 1, right? So I've literally just copied the text across, so no math so far. And then I want to work out the actual amount in the pure concentrate. So if you imagine your perfume, right, it's currently 100 grams, and in that 100 grams, you've got a load of alcohol from those pre-dilutions, plus the actual amount of raw material that's sitting inside of it. So I want to know what is the actual amount of each raw material sitting inside that 100 grams, i.e. the amount of what actually is pure of the raw materials. So I'm just going to say the amounts, well, let's say current amounts of the RM in grams, because obviously later on we're going to have a new amount. So, let's just put in even amount, because I want to make sure we've got enough space to do the other columns. So that is going to equal to the weight times by the pre-dilution, but because it's a percentage, we want it as a fraction, we're going to divide that by 100. So that's going to get us the actual amounts of each pure raw material in the formula. And what I want to do is get the total of that. So I'm going to do a sum across that column. So the total amount of pure concentrate currently in our formula that we've made as 100 grams is 9.658 grams. So, okay, that's cool. That's currently where we stand. Now we're going to go and look at the perfume we want to make. So we're going to make our desired perfume. Right, so this is going to be like what we're trying to achieve. So we're going to say the desired percentage is going to be like, you know, say you want an EDP, 20% EDP. That's what most people want. So this is the usual problem people have, right? Which is why I'm making this video. Hey, I made my formula with pre-dilutions, and now it's only 9.58%, like an eau de toilette concentration, but I want it to be an eau de parfum. I want it to be stronger. I want it to be like 20%. So how do I make it? That's what we're doing here, right? So we're going to say, okay, cool. Let's say we want a 20% eau de parfum. And then it's like, how much do we want to make, right? desired amount in grams. So say we want to fill up a 50 milliliter bottle of perfume. Well, because perfume is a little bit less dense than water, usually it's like a little bit lighter, right? Usually for a 50 ml bottle of perfume, you may want something a bit like 40 grams of perfume. So I'm going to say we want to make 40 grams. But obviously the actual amount of grams of perfume you want to make, that's up to you. You know, usually for a formula, you should try different amounts and go and actually fill up a bottle and weigh how much perfume it takes to fill it up, right? Because, you know, every bottle's a little bit different. But for this example, I'm going to say we want 40 grams of perfume. But what I'm trying to say is when you do this example yourself, you can change these numbers. So that 20%, if you want 25%, just put in 25 here. If you want, say 100 grams of perfume or you want 200 grams, just put that number in there. So next we're going to, well, now we've got the amount of perfume and the percentage, let's dissect that a little bit further. So of that 40 grams, we need to now work out how much is going to be alcohol and how much is going to be concentrate. So the desired amount of alcohol, well, let's do the concentrate first, right? Concentrate is grams, is going to be equal to 40 grams times 20% of it, right? So times this one, because percent it's over 100. So we're going to have 8 grams of concentrate and then desired amount of alcohol in grams is just going to be what's left over, right? So it's going to equal to the 40 grams of the whole perfume minus that 8 which is taken up with the concentrate. So in theory, our perfume will have 8 grams of concentrate, 32 grams of alcohol. Pretty simple so far, right? So now going back to our formula up here. Well, what we've just gone and done is for the formula we've made, we've looked at it and we've worked out that currently the concentrate of this formula we've made up with pre-dilutions consists of 9.658 grams of raw material. So now what I want to do is scale this formula. So this is the concentrate that we've already made in theory using this method. We're just ignoring the alcohol. We're saying, well, now actually for the perfume we want to make, say we're going to make it out of pure raw materials, how much pure raw material of each raw material would we need if we wanted to make the right concentrate for our theoretical perfume we're trying to make? So currently we have a current amount of concentrate is this in our formula is equal to that number there. So what we want to do is I want to make a scaling factor. So I want to scale those amounts, you know, all proportionately from the 9.658 gram concentrate we've already got to the 8 gram concentrate that we want, because that's what we need for our desired concentration. So scaling factor is equal to the desired amount of concentrate divided by the current amount we've already have. So that little ratio goes right there. And then what I want to do is now scale each of these individual entries in order to, you know, make sure we can get that 8 grams total. So how much of each pure raw material would I theoretically need to get these amounts we want? So what I'll do is, so I'll put a column for the scaling factor just to make life a bit easier. So we're going to put that as this number here. And then I'm going to kind of, oh, what happened there? Oops. So I'm going to copy this down the whole column, so it's the same number, and then we're going to do the new amount of the raw material in grams, and that is equal to the old amount times by the scaling factor. So there we go, that's our new formula. So in theory, if we just had all of our raw materials in pure form, 100%, and we want to take our formula and we want to make a 40 gram perfume, so about 50 mils-ish, and we want to make a 20% EDP, we'd simply take a beaker, we would take 32 grams of alcohol, and then we would create 8 grams of concentrate, which is, you know, split over all of these bits here, and then we would weigh them out individually. So, you know, maybe you put in the concentrate first, so you'd weigh out 2.48 grams of hedione, you know, blah, blah, blah. You'd weigh out all of these individual amounts of each of these raw materials, and then at the end you could go and add your 32 grams of alcohol, and there you go. You've got the perfume that you want. So that's on a basic level how you do this. However, there is another little caveat, and that is, if you look at this formula currently, this is a little bit too small to weigh out, 0.003 grams. Even on a 0.001 gram scale, it's not actually accurate to weigh that, because, it's near to the amount that would evaporate while you're weighing it, for example. And, scales aren't quite sensitive at that very low amount. It's hard for you to dispense it, reliably. It's way easy to add a bit too much. So then comes the next problem, is how do we make sure we can actually make it accurately, right? So the easy solution is to simply just make a load more of the perfume. So obviously you could have the desired amount there. You could make a liter, right? So you can make a kilogram or something of that. You can make 800 grams, a kilogram of your perfume. And then obviously that will give you a new scaling factor, and then you put that in the scaling factor column. So let's say, for example, our scaling factor just happened to be 10 times bigger. Well, then look, you can see scaling factor be 10 times bigger, and then this isn't so small anymore. So it's possible to weigh out 0.033 grams of pure isoamyl isovalerate. But the problem with that is now you have to make up a big batch of perfume, but maybe it's really expensive, your raw materials, or you don't want to waste them, and maybe you just don't need that much. So it's not always practical to go and do that. So instead of multiplying the amount we're going to make, there is another method that we can do. And that is actually using some pre-dilutions as part of how we make the perfume. And this, what I'm about to explain to you, is also really important for if you have a raw material that comes already diluted. So you often find something like galaxolide comes to you at 50% dilution, which means even if you want to follow this formula for it, you don't have pure 100% galaxolide, so you literally cannot weigh this out pure. So the next part is, how do you then go and use some dilutions when it's convenient to help you make that concentrate, but still keep the desired overall 20% and the desired overall amount that you want. So the way I'm going to do this is add another column, and this one's going to be called production pre-dilution in percentage. So we're going to say this is going to be another column where we can edit the numbers and we can decide what different pre-dilutions we want to add. So we'll fill that in a little bit, and then we're going to do the amount to use. So this is going to say how much then should we actually put in of those pre-dilutions, because it's going to be slightly different than if we were doing it pure. And that's because if you're using a pre-diluted raw material as opposed to a pure one, then to compensate, you're going to have to use a little bit more of it. So you've got the same amount in overall. So the amount to use. So this is going to be the final amount we actually put in the formula. So essentially the formula for this column is going to be the amount here divided by, then in brackets, the production pre-dilution, because it's percent, again, we want to divide that by 100. So it's going to be divided by the production pre-dilution divided by 100, close the brackets. So we need to put some stuff in this column. So at the moment, we're doing everything pure. So let's put 100 in all the columns, and we should get out the same numbers that we started off with. See, so this column looks currently the same as this column. But now we can change these numbers. Say we decided we want to use a different dilution. It's going to tell us how much then of that new dilution we would actually have to put in the perfume. So for isoamyl isovalerate, instead of using pure, why don't we use it 10% diluted? And then because of that, it's already weaker, we can now weigh out more of it in the formula, which is going to make it more accurate. So if I go and put 10%, we use a 10% dilution of it instead. Now we can actually go and weigh out 0.033 grams, which is just about accurate enough to weigh. That should be about 2 drops on the scale. And then we can make our formula up using that concentrate instead, right? So if we wanted to make it even more accurate, because both of these 0.028 and the 0.033 is still quite inaccurate, it's just a couple of drops, remember? Well, if we make this Ambrom Absolute 10% and we use a 1% pre-dilution just for the isoamyl isovalerate, because it's just such a small quantity we want, but everything else in the formula we're making using 100%, then look, we've got things that we can weigh out accurately now across the whole formula. Now, the only thing about this is it adds a slight little caveat. Because we've added some of our alcohol now already in the pre-dilutions, that means we have to add a little bit less alcohol at the end. So that 32 grams isn't quite right anymore. So the way we're going to work that out is find out the total amount now that we've weighed out, you know, from the pure raw materials and any pre-dilutions we've used. So we're going to do a sum of that column. And that's, oops, what have I done? What have I done there? Okay, we're going to do a sum of that column. And that's going to tell us now that our like kind of slightly modified concentrate is 8.581 grams. That means now that the total amount of alcohol to use is just going to be the total amount that we would have added originally minus that amount, right? So amount alcohol to use in grams equals the total formula amount that we wanted for our final perfume minus the kind of concentrate amount, let's say. So it's 31.419. So what this is saying is, if we want to make the perfume, we want it to be at 20%, 40 gram EDP. We've done all these calculations. We simply weigh out all of the raw materials at these given dilutions. So most of them are pure at these amounts, but this one's pre-diluted and this one's pre-diluted. So we just use those pre-dilutions. And then afterwards, we just top it up with 31.419 grams of alcohol. And that's it. Then you've got your perfume exactly as you wanted it. So yeah, just copy this spreadsheet and apply it to your own perfume and you should be absolutely fine. So that's pretty much all there is to it. I hope you found this video useful and I hope you can actually go and apply this now to your own perfumes. Hopefully I'll get less questions about this in the future. I probably will get the same amount of questions still, but at least I can now just paste the link to this video. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, guys. I hope it helped you out and I'll see you very soon with another video all about perfumery.